Welcome back to Mr. Bob's Builds. As foreshadowed in the last episode, I'm going to be talking today about palettes for acrylic paints. The shot of the faun in front of you is the only one you'll see of her today. However, good progress is being made with the brush, and I'll be describing that in the next episode. So here goes 12 or so minutes of me banging on about palettes. As an incentive, there's a bit of cake at the end. You see there the traditional well type palette, a tile, and two sorts of wet palette, and it's the wet palettes in particular I'm going to be talking about. When putting some paint on a figure and I only need to do a few brush strokes, I'll typically use a tile. The tile's got a nice smooth surface and it's easy to mix paint on. I'm going to put a couple of dabs of paint on, and here we have Vallejo's English uniform, which is a good general colour for English uniforms, but sometimes you need a bit of work just to give it a bit of variety. And I'm going to put a dab of beige on as well, which is a good highlight colour for English uniform. And then with a wet brush, because it's always too thick to work with, just draw a bit of both on there and start mixing to the shade you want. Tiny bit wet, that's better. Test on a piece of tissue. And now that's ready just to do a tiny bit of highlighting on a 1/35 figure, for example. The advantage of the tile is it's quick and easy to use, it's a smooth surface for mixing, and it's very easy to clean. The disadvantages are that once we've thinned that paint out, it's not going to stay open for long, it's not going to remain workable for more than, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. I'm going to put that to one side now. Another palette I like to work with when just doing single coats is a well palette, which means that you can mix a goodly amount of paint and it'll stay workable for a good while. I typically use that when doing base coats. The advantage of this sort of palette is that it takes a nice amount of paint, it's easy to use, and the different wells mean that you can keep colours separate. You could even put a little bit of water in the central one, or a bit of flow improver or a retarder, and mix at your pleasure. Disadvantages are, as you can see, the state of the palette. It's not that easy to clean. Next up we have the first of my wet palettes, and this is a little homemade job. It's a small plastic tray which I'm not sure what it came from originally, but it's a nice small size. In there there's a bit of blotting paper which holds water, and I've got a zippy bag there which it goes into when I'm not working on it, and it remains wet. Just to show how this works, I'm going to put a bit of water on the blotting paper because it's dry. A bit of kitchen towel would work, a kitchen rag of some sort, a cloth, a J cloth, and it's anything that just soaks up and holds the water. Move that around so it's completely covered. And onto that goes a bit of greaseproof paper from the kitchen cupboard. The purpose of the wet palette is to stop the water that makes up the part of the binder of acrylic paints from evaporating, and therefore it stays open. What I'm going to do is put the same two colours on this that I did on the tiles. So we've got a bit of English uniform, bit of beige, and then with a damp brush just going to blend a bit of those two together. That's the sort of consistency I like working with. Work a bit of paint off on the cloth. And now we have a very thin mixture there, which I'm spreading out a bit, of the blended colour. And then I can add a bit more of the light colour here, and a bit more. So I've got an extended palette working from a mid-tone to a light, and I can put a bit of dark here. And when working on a figure, I can pick the particular shade that I want in a particular small area. And as it's on a wet palette, it's going to stay workable in that state with no lid on, a good half an hour. When I finish working with that, and if I wanted to go back to it later and let the particular layers on a figure dry, I'll put the wet palette away, and for convenience I've opened up the side of the bag and it just slides in. I fold it under, and that is sealed enough for the time being. My main workhorse, it's a wet palette, and it's a lot larger than the others. And on that wet palette, I can lay out a variety of colours, mix up a variety of glazes and tones and layers, and keep returning to them time and time again. This is a commercial product. It's made by a firm called Masterson's, but it's easy enough to make your own. All you need with a wet palette is something to hold water and a lid, so a Tupperware container, a Flora tub, anything like that. But what makes this particularly useful is the low sides on it, which means that it's easy to get the brush in and out. Let's open the lid, see what's inside. When you buy these, it comes with a piece of sponge and some membrane. The membrane that comes with this particular kit is semi-porous, which works very well with artist tube acrylics because they're heavy body, and the paint itself doesn't soak through. But with our fluid acrylics and our wet mixtures for figures, that would quickly soak into that membrane and stain the sponge here, and also means that the paint is less usable for a long period of time. What I use is Sainsbury's greaseproof paper, and I buy a roll, cut it to size, and use it when I want. Just put a bit of water on there. This takes a fair bit of water, but this is damp already. Give it a good soaking. It's ordinary tap water, and then that sits on the top. And you can see the moisture underneath that. It doesn't actually come through the greaseproof, but it's sufficient to stop the water evaporating and activating the polymers in the binder. Let's put our two colours on there. That's a messy bowl. Bit of water. And again, we can mix shades to our heart's content. And I can go in there, stick my brush in where I like, and get whichever shades I want. The advantage of this particular one, as I said, is the low ledge. Sometimes a Tupperware box will have a higher ridge, which means you have to stick the brush down to get into it. And also this lid, which fits nice and tightly. And that paint will remain workable with that lid on for a good couple of days. One thing you need to be aware of with any wet palette is, because it's moist in there, and if you put a lid on and leave it for a day or two, you're going to come back and it's going to be completely covered with mould. So if you are going to go away and leave it with a lid on, put a bit of kitchen bacterial spray, and that will stop that mould forming. And here we have the three palettes that I've just shown you, the tile, the small wet palette and the larger wet palette. They've all got the paint on them. There's been a gap from when I first started. I've done this pretty much live, so you can tell how much time we've spent doing this to get this far. And even in such a short space of time, the differences on the state of the paint is quite marked. I'll show you that in a bit more detail now. Okay, this is the tile. You can see here the thin paint is, well, it's unusable. It's unusable now. This was the paint I mixed up, and the body paint, the blobs, it's dried at the edges. And it's got a skin on it, which means I could probably use the centre of each blob to paint, but I wouldn't be happy with it. Now the smaller wet palette. Let's clean my brush. Okay, there's the various shades. The pigment is starting to separate out of the water in the binder, but that's not a problem because we can mix it all together. And each part of that is as usable as it was when I first mixed it. And now the larger palette, it's going to be the same as the smaller one, I hope. And with that lid on this particular palette, that's going to remain usable for... Without a lid on, it's going to be usable for, well, probably a good half an hour to an hour. With a lid on, days really. While I was making this film, I became concerned that the paint was beading up on the wet palettes, and that the mixtures I've made didn't stay together. Now, why they came back together again with the application of a brush, it wasn't what I was used to. And then I realised that we'd changed our brand of greaseproof paper. And the one that I used for the demonstration, which is the one in the front there, the Sainsbury's greaseproof and baking paper, is non-stick. It's a thicker parchment with a non-stick coating. I went out shopping and I bought myself a cheap roll of Essential Waitrose greaseproof. And as you can see, it works perfectly. And the blends remain damp and don't bead up. So, there's a lesson there. Dearer isn't always better. And when buying greaseproof for your wet palettes, don't get a non-stick one. On the other hand, the non-stick version works very well here. Dundee cake. Enough of this madness. Well, I hope that you found that interesting, or maybe even useful. Next in line in this series, I hope to do a short bit about blending acrylics. That'll either be part of the ongoing Faun saga or a standalone film. Until the next time then, goodbye for now. Thank you for watching. Come back soon.